The world of Formula One could well be set for an 11th team to join the grid. Now, if you've been following Formula One in recent times, you'd know that the teams and the sport in general has been very, very happy sticking to the 10 teams that are already existing. And given a lot of reasons or a lot of factors have actually worked out in favor of the sport, those 10 teams now all set to become profit-making entities in the times to come. So why exactly is it that F1 now is so keen to add an 11th team, and who could one of those, or who are the candidates to become that 11th team? This is something that we're going to analyze in this video, and there are some candidates, it is worth noting, who've made public proclamations of their intention to join the grid. Others are a little bit on the rumored side, but we're going to look at all of those candidates, whether or not it makes sense for them to join, and more importantly, why it is that Formula One suddenly finds itself a sport in demand, especially for manufacturer teams. Now, the entire ordeal started with this tweet by Mohammed bin Sulayem, who's of course the chief of the FIA, which is Formula One's governing body. He said, very simply, I've asked my FIA team to look at launching an expressions of interest process for prospective new teams for the FIA F1 World Championship. With just these few words, bin Sulayem actually managed to get the entire F1 fan base very, very excited. Why? Well, because there has been a growing clamor that with F1 suddenly becoming a very attractive option for more teams, that the series should maybe look to add one or two more teams. But generally speaking, there were a number of reasons why that wasn't exactly the case, and that's what we're going to be looking at here. This is indeed a change of heart from both Formula One, the FIA, as well as the teams. Previously, the teams had been hostile to newer entrants. Why was that the case? Well, that's because quite simply, the teams were happy maintaining the 10-team status, simply due to the fact that it would actually ensure that all of these teams could, in the long run, become more and more financially sustainable. It had essentially become a franchise model of sorts, where the 10 teams looked to divide whatever prize money was there and thus actually add to their earnings, become more sustainable in the long run, become attractive to newer investors. That is one of the main reasons why these teams were so against it to at least begin with. And what was also worth noting is that previously there have been a lot of teams who've joined Formula One. In fact, if you look back only 10 years prior, you had a point where there was, 11 and then 12 teams on the grid. But a lot of those teams weren't really in it for the long run. They were financed by, obviously rich people or people with a passion for motorsport, but they didn't quite know how to navigate Formula One in the long run, and therefore ended up actually withdrawing and shutting down the teams, which does cause a lot of trouble, not just for drivers, but also the people who are employed by those teams. The fourth point was, and this is perhaps the most important, is that the existing 10 teams were not keen to add a new member that easily. That is because in the Concord agreement signed by all the 10 teams, it was ensured that the series would remain a 10-team series until at least 25-26. And if a new team had to join before that, they would have to pay a hefty anti-dilution fund. Now, the anti-dilution fund was worth about $200 million that would be split evenly among the 10 teams. And this was put in place to ensure that these teams would be okay with the fact that the prize money pot would be diluted if, of course, there was a new team that came into place in the Formula One calendar or in the Formula One sport as it is that we speak. Now, beyond just this, of course, you have to be asking yourself why. Why is it that suddenly, out of nowhere, Formula One and of course, the sport and people around the sport or people who are watching the sport are so interested in coming aboard and joining on the F1 gravy train? Reasons for that are fairly simple. For one, the sport of Formula One remains more popular than ever now than it has been for quite some time. The reasons for that are, well, largely down to the Netflix TV show Drive to Survive, which has actually, popularized the sport amongst a lot of sections of fans who perhaps previously weren't as into Formula One as others might have been. So the Netflix series has particularly seen a strong growth of the sport in USA, and we'll get to why that's important in just a bit, because one of the teams in place is actually an American team. So the other reason why it's suddenly so attractive, if you look at the second point, is that there's been a strict budget cap imposed. So what used to happen previously is that the teams who could spend more and more on development of the cars would eventually be the teams that would be emerging on top. Now, however, every single one of the teams have a budget cap to adhere to, and they can't spend beyond their means. So every single team can, in theory, be spending only the same amount, and that has made it more attractive for newer investors because it means they won't have to plow as much money in as they would have had to previously. The third reason is, of course, that there's been a push for sustainability in Formula One, not just in terms of the teams being self-sustaining and being attractive to new investors, sponsorships, so that they can keep existing without needing bailouts or with the threat of shutting down, but also within Formula One itself. So the sport is aiming to be carbon neutral by the year 2030. It's also aiming to develop a new sustainable ethanol-based fuel that would be used to power not just Formula One cars, but could also be used for road cars as well. So there's a major push for sustainability, and that is something that is attracting a lot of automobile manufacturers who are keen to get in on the business of sustainable fuels, because as we know, the planet does need sustainable fuels, and the time for carbon-based fuels would sooner or later be coming to an end. The last and most important point, or one of the more important points, is that the regulations for the sport are now very, very easy. Previously, F1 regulations were complicated, and truth be told, they still are to a degree, but the current regulations of cars have been eased out. In fact, in 2026, when the new engines come in, the engine manufacturing rules have also been simplified. The MGU-H has been dropped. It was a complicated component of the power unit. So the aim for F1 is not just to attract new teams, but specifically one type of team, and that is manufacturers, car manufacturers. And that is why when you look at the teams who have been linked with a new F1 project in recent times, there's one common feature, is that almost all of them are manufacturer teams. Because if you look at the main contenders, there's Andretti Autosport, and that is the American team that I was mentioning earlier, who would be one of the key candidates. They interestingly have gone public and said that not only will we bring the Andretti name, but if we can make it to the grid in 2026, they'll be bringing General Motors, luxury car makers, Cadillac along with them as partners. Now, whether Cadillac will be an engine manufacturer or whether it'll be purely a branding and sponsorship arrangement, something that we don't quite know, but Formula One would be keen to have the branding of a car like Cadillac on its grid, and bringing in another manufacturer would ease Andretti's bid, which so far has been met with stodgy resistance by all of the existing 10 F1 teams. Honda are another contender, and of course they had left the sport at the end of the 21 season, but are still involved in some fashion, considering they are manufacturing and making the components for Red Bull's engines right now, which are badged as Red Bull powertrain engines. But for the 2023 season onwards, these seasons will be known as Honda Red Bull powertrain engines. So Honda's presence, despite them leaving, is only increasing, and they have signed up for the 2026 engine rules with or without Honda. So you could very well see a case where Honda have either an engine, or better yet, they could very well even be having a new works team for the first time since 2008. Porsche obviously were one of those teams who were very, very interested to join, along with VW sister group Audi. Now, Porsche were in talks with Red Bull to seal a deal for 2026. Those fell apart, but Porsche remains keen to enter the sport. So you could very well see Porsche entering the sport as well, if they choose to go it a different way than they did with Red Bull. Ford and Hyundai are two teams that have also been mentioned. Now, Ford, you'd remember, were part of F1 when they had the Jaguar team that ironically was bought off by Red Bull and then ended up becoming a big success. But beyond that, Ford haven't really been involved with the sport since. Hyundai, there's an interesting reason as to why it is that they could well be in the a race for getting into F1. That's because they recently brought in Cyril Abiteboul, who you would remember was the Renault team principal, and he's been put in charge of their rallying division. Now, he's obviously doesn't really have, he's well known for his time in F1, and that's led to rumors that Hyundai themselves might be interested in breaking into the sport, whether it be as an engine manufacturer or as a works team. So these, by the way, are just 4 or 5 contenders who, at this point, their interest is either public or it's rumored. There could very well be new teams coming into the mix, and don't forget, so far at least, there's only been a push for one team. But it speaks to the popularity of F1, and it speaks to the fact that the regulation changes or the changes that are being made to the rules, to the sustainability, to ensure that the playing field is very level, has made the sport a very, very attractive proposition for newer investment. That, as well as the time where the sport had stagnated in terms of popularity. Recently it's been soaring, so now would be as great a time as ever. So full credit actually has to go to F1's media rights owners, Liberty Management, who've done a good job at making the sport attractive, not just to newer fans but newer investors. And we could very well be set for an 11 team sooner rather than later. I, for one, personally hope we get an 11th or maybe even 12th team, because the more grids spots there are for drivers, the better it is for all of them who will be vying for those seats. But that's just how I feel about it. What do you guys think? Well, you can let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and tap the bell so you know when it is we're going live or uploading a new video for you guys. Then you can also go ahead and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And last but not least, don't forget to download the AajTak app. Thank you all once again for joining us. I hope to see you with us through the day. But for now, goodbye.